There are nuances that differ between drivers in terms of how they approach what they're feeling. Do they need a really solid feeling rear end to go quick, or can they drive very transiently and keep the car on the edge all the time and still be quick in that way? It's absolutely fascinating once you get into marrying up what you see in the data with the driver's feedback, and that's kind of where the gold lies.
Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 39. Welcome to part 2 of my talk with F1 vehicle dynamics engineer Richard Frith. In part 1, we discuss Richard's early career, how to go testing, and how to use data to improve your driving. In part 2, you'll learn about how F1 teams have developed great driver feedback, where that fits in their development priorities, and how to use that to develop the best setup on the car. We also discuss what you should change for your setup in the wet. If you've not listened to part 1 yet, I suggest popping back and giving that a listen first. But if you're all set, then as ever, grab a pen, grab a coffee, sit back, and let's hear what Richard has to say. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. Where does the driver come into this then? Because when you talk about moving target, it makes me think, actually, different drivers are going to have different effects on the tyre. We hear all the time about, this driver's really good at looking after their tyres or whatever. Where's the driver come into getting the most out of the kit, and how, what have you experienced working with drivers, and how do they influence the development and some of those setup directions? Do you ignore them? Do you listen to everything they say? Is it something in the middle?
Yeah, absolutely. Just staying on tyres for a second there. One of the biggest factors is the driving style. It's pretty huge in terms of tyre temperature management, because each driver will push the tyre in a different way around the lap, through the corners, under braking, entry, exit. They will take more or less sliding at a given point in terms of, how they want to rotate the car. Some drivers will be very smooth. Some drivers will have a more kind of what we'd say is an open loop approach, and a more transient way in which they get the car to turn.
So is that with the steering or with all the controls?
Yeah, with all the controls, but you see it most obviously in the steering. A case in point, one of the distinctive, well-known ones, take Alonso, driving style with steering, in that he kind of uses the steering to sense the gradients. When I say gradients, he uses the steering at small perturbations to essentially gauge what the car is going to do before he makes a big input to the steering. So he's almost like making small adjustments and feeling how the car responds to that. And then his brain is then inferring from that how it's going to react to the actual entry maneuver, the actual turn-in maneuver. And that's really interesting, because that's part of his mental mapping of the car. And you would have heard the analogy of, the car being like a thrown dart from entry.
No, I haven't heard that one, actually.
Yeah, so if you think of the entry to the corner, if you imagine someone throwing the dart, and the entry to the corner is the point at which the dart leaves the hand. Because if you're driving the car, if you're really pushing the car at the limit, you can argue in some senses that the trajectory of the car subsequently from that point of entry is almost like a ballistic trajectory. If you're at the limit, there is no control margin left. And what I mean by control margin is you've saturated the tyres. It may be saturated at the rear, it may be saturated at the front as well. So the inputs to steering are not going to affect what the car is doing at that point, because your axles are saturated. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's kind of like that. Once the dart has left the hand, that's going to define how quickly you go through that corner. So how you enter the corner to a certain extent is going to have a very large bearing on how quickly you take that corner, because it's going to affect your rolling speed through the apex. It's going to affect the line and the subsequent car states that will snowball into how much grip you've got, how your downforce is affected, what your tyre temperatures are doing at that instant. So if you're looking at where the most valuable part of having the grip and performance in the car is, you tend to look at the sort of the grip limit and entry and the grip limit at exit, because often the bit right in the middle. I mean, we've done some simulation studies in the past, adding downforce around the lap and seeing where it counts the most. I mean, to improve the lap time a lot, once you get specifically to the apex, you actually have to add a lot more to get a given lap time improvement than you do if you add it at the entry or the exit. But it's also true that often you want to concentrate more on the low speed corners, because that's, in terms of the time spent, that integral of time spent in low speed, that all adds up. And it usually adds up to more than the time spent in the high speed corners. In a very simplistic way, it's probably why you focus a little bit more on the low speed corners.
Yeah, so the challenge is different, because a previous guest, James Napton, said the same thing. And in fact, a few people have said similar. Damien Harty said a similar thing about, the focus on the low speed. And this is interesting, because I've had the conversation with driver coaches, and they look at me and go like, what? And the reason, I think this is where there's maybe a distinction between the pro and the amateur, because at the amateur level, the high speed stuff is terrifying.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I was going to add the caveat to that you really have to look at where your performance limitations are around the lap. So if you've got excess headroom in high speed corners, and what I mean by headroom is the gap between the ultimate potential of the car and where your driver is what I call headroom. If you've got a lot of headroom, driver confidence is going to be huge. So if the driver hasn't got the grip or the balance that he needs, you're going to leave a lot on the table in high speed corners, and you're going to be slow. Also, things like what I would call like a transient grip limited sequence of corners. So if you imagine a change of direction going on to a long power limited straight, well, that's going to be very handling dependent. So the balance and the handling through that change of direction is going to be really critical. And it may be a high speed change of direction, but if you haven't got the balance of the car in there, then you're going to be slow. Your exit speed is going to be slow, and that's going to hurt you all the way down that straight. And then there's also things like the tyre management. So it could be that your tyres are dropping out of their operational window in terms of temperature, because you're oversliding them in a high-speed corner, or they're getting too hot, or they may actually be too cold by the end of the straight. So you're then compromising your braking. So it's very generic to say, well, you focus on low-speed corners. There's all kinds of limitations.
From the specifics, it's a case of trying to help people with I'm going to use it. It's in my head, like low-hanging fruit. I don't want to say it. But it is that kind of thing. It's sort of a lot of people say get the basics right, but they don't always say what the basics are. So the tyres is a standard one in terms of, well, you can set the pressures of them. So make sure that, that's giving you the grip at the time when you most want it, kind of thing. And you can also affect the balance with the tyre pressures by changing front to rear as well, even without touching anything else. And so it's about getting these basics right, but then also understanding, okay, it's almost like a staircase of refinements that you can go through. It's like, okay, well, I've got to the point, I'm confident in the high speed corners. Now I'm going to find some time. Right. Entry onto low speed, maybe.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really useful to get compares to other drivers. If you're able to get an overlay to another driver that's quicker, you start to see where you're leaving a lot on the table, and then you can start to get your teeth into where that's coming from. Is it the driver's approach, or is it in the car itself, or is it in the tyres? But yeah, you need to generate insights that are telling you about where, first of all, you need to know where you're slower and where you're slowest, where you're underperforming, and then you can set about fixing that. So if you don't know where you're slow, that's the first problem. Everything after that is kind of an engineering problem, or it's a psychology problem.
Well, one of the things that I'd get your opinion on this. Actually, I don't know, but there's some of the data that we have available at a club level is acceleration data. So you've got longitudinal lateral acceleration. And so one method that I've seen used, I certainly use, to try and work out these opportunities is to do a vector G thing. So you sort of you combine your G into one trace and then look for dips, in effect. Now, there's a lot of assumption, again, that goes into that, i.e. that you've got the same grip all the way around the track on every corner, but at least it gives you some suggestion of what these opportunities are. I don't know if that's something you've seen done before.
Yeah, I'm not sure specifically in that way. I mean, I probably have to have a look at what it is exactly that you're talking about. But I mean, we do a lot of, there's a lot of stuff with GG diagrams.
Sorry, in effect, it's if you take the friction circle.
Oh, you see where you're coming inside of that essentially as a.
But you plot it out as another channel against distance.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that sounds like a pretty sensible approach, I would say. Do you get yaw rate or anything like that? Kind
of. It's just a bit. The sensor quality is a bit unreliable, I think. So
the thing is, I'm probably a little bit spoiled. So we're spoiled with data. So there's probably things you do with quite a limited data set that I probably is probably fairly new to me in terms of interpreting. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to understand. Are you under or overperforming? I think the problem with if you've got a track day car is knowing actually where the ultimate potential of it lies.
One thing on driver style, you mentioned Fernando and these little inputs. I've not heard that before from him, and I've heard of his. He does have this particular style, but when you said that, it reminded me of a previous guest who'd been on the show, Rob Wilson, who's done a lot of driver coaching, and he talks about something similar, but in the way of you're kind of giving the car a clue as to what you're about to ask it to do.
It's a similar thing because that's really informing the driver about what the local gradients are in terms of the car response, so that he can set his expectation for what the car is about to do. So
you've seen that in his data.
Yeah. So the driver will feel whether the rear is right on the limit or whether he's got excessive control margin in the front that's going to make the car very pointy, or he'll feel whether he's about to get some understeer on turn in. So yeah, I mean, it's the interesting thing about drivers is that they're nearly all different, and in terms of what they want from the car setup, can vary quite a lot. I mean, some drivers are really don't like the feeling of the car moving around on the tires at the rear. So sometimes when you got, say, like on a wet tire, you have a bigger tread block, or on sometimes on a softer compound, the tread block has a bit less stiffness, and the car can move around on that a little bit at the rear, and it's disconcerting for some drivers, and for others they deal with it quite well and can take the extra grip that comes with the soft compound and really deliver on it, and others find that there's like that loss of stability that they feel from moving around on the tread block. They really struggle with it. So yeah, I mean, different drivers operate in slightly different ways, and the controller, let's say, there are nuances that differ between drivers in terms of how they approach what they're feeling. Do they need a really solid feeling rear end to go quick, or can they drive very transiently and keep the car on the edge all the time and still be quick in that way? So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating once you get into marrying up what you see in the data with the driver's feedback, and that's kind of where the gold lies. And yeah, I know we did a lot of work on that in McLaren in sort of recent years. I left there at the end of last year, but in the preceding 2 or 3 years, I think we'd focused a lot on getting more out of the driver feedback in conjunction with the data, and really understanding how the individual drivers were driving and what they wanted from the car. And I think it brought some good progression in terms of the direction of the car development.
Have you got any tips for driver feedback? Because it's a subject that does come up quite a lot. I mean, is there anything that you think actually that's something we discovered and works really well, because driver feedback in an amateur world, or when it's your hobby, can feel like a bit of an admin overhead, to be honest with you. So not for everyone, but for many people, they just want to get out and have a chat. So what is it that, is there one or two things there that they can just go like, if I do nothing else, I should do this bit of driver feedback, because that's really going to help me next time out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it pays to be structured. So when we do the simulator work, whether it's in FE or F1, we'll always be very structured in how we debrief the drivers, and we'll talk about turn in, entry, apex, exit, high speed, low speed. We'll talk about that in terms of balance. We'll try and get the driver to grade in terms of numerically where the balance is, going from understeer, oversteer. We'll give those numbers based on an agreed reference point. And it also pays sometimes to say to the driver, okay, what's your biggest limitation? Try not to clutter the feedback, because sometimes you can have too much and it's hard to pick out of that what is really useful and what's not. So, often we say, just give us three big things that we can fix with this car. And just saying, what would you need to go faster? If there's one thing you need to go faster in this car, what is that? And apart from that, I mean, I think if you're structured, you're detailed, get the driver to expand when they say, well, all right, it feels rubbish there, feel great. Is it a balance limitation? Is it grip limitation? If it's a balance limitation, what is it equivalent to? Is there an example that you could point to that you've had in the past, a setup change that might fix that? So it's really about just keying into and sort of digging into a little bit all of the whys of why are they saying that, and can we see it in the data? So the thing I always bang on about to the guys in the simulator is, the driver says something, I want to know that we see it in the data, and if we don't see it in the data, we need to be asking why and questioning that, and not being satisfied until we do see it in the data. So repose that question to the driver and understand what he actually means.
That's the balance, isn't it? It's that constant tension between, like, has the driver imagined it, or can we just not see it, or whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, I think as well, when it comes to things like simulator testing, it's important to be objective, because simulator test drivers, they do need to know, you can't just give them blind tests all the time, because the simulator it's not the real car. I mean, there is a time and place for blind testing, but you need to prompt them about what they should be focusing on. You don't have to say specifically what the test is, but you might say, I want you to focus a bit on your braking, your initial braking, the grip and balance in initial braking. I'll be looking for some feedback on that. We'll focus on these corners. And I think the thing with driver feedback as well is it's as much about the briefing as the debriefing. So, if someone goes and drives a lap, knowing what they're going to be expected to comment on, not in a leading way, actually, in terms of, okay, they're going to be interested in the balance in low speed, or the balance in high speed, or the curbing, or the braking, then because the driver is then primed, they'll be thinking about that as they drive their lap, and then you can pull from them more value after they've driven the lap.
Yeah, it's a tricky subject, isn't it, that one? Because there's a lot of people who insist on, it's got to be blind, otherwise if you tell the driver what you're looking for, he'll just make something up or whatever. And part of me just I struggle with that a bit in the sense of, because they say, you're complaining about that, and then they'll make up like they've made some changes. The driver will go back out and say, yeah, that feels better. And they're like trying to catch the driver out a little bit.
Yeah, and it's not a good, I mean, you can destroy the trust between the engineer and the driver quite easily doing that, and because they're not infallible. And it's a really tricky job. Coming back to the, as we were saying, the best model of a cat is a cat. We accept that simulators, they don't all feel like the real car exactly, but they are a really useful delta machine, let's say, that gives you magnitude and direction for changes if your model, if what you own in the model is more or less correct and you understand it. So, there's an acceptance that we're driving a model, and the driver and the engineers need to be complicit in that. It needs to be a harmonious working environment where we all know the limitations, but we're all pushing towards improving the car. So you have to be consistent and structured, I think, when it comes to testing and getting driver feedback.
Look, Richard, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I could talk to you all day.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Samir.
It's not often you get a chance to talk with such top-level F1 engineers. What always strikes me is the way they seem to be able to simplify so many of the complexities. It's not only the theories and concepts, though, but the processes they follow to ensure they're confusing themselves less. Clearly, they have a resource advantage over, anyone else, frankly. But I really hope this window into Richard's approach and ways of thinking can help you reflect on your own understanding and your own approaches for the future. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.